Good morning, everyone. My name is Melissa Ryan, and I'm the editor of Control Alt Right Delete and the CEO of Card Strategies. I am also a proud board member for Netroots Nation. Thank you for being here this morning. This panel is close to my heart. It's something I've been thinking about all year. It's been 10 months since the January 6th insurrection, and America still hasn't reconciled with this attack on our nation. Congress was unable to form a bipartisan independent commission. Most Republican electeds either downplay the coup or deny that it happened at all. And a modern lost cause myth has emerged around the insurrectionists and their motivations. Meanwhile, the Hill remains a workplace for thousands of people, from custodians to members of Congress, who continue to go to work every day despite any trauma they might have. I admire that folks do this, and I'm so livid that they have to. So today we're going to talk about how our lack of accountability has turned Congress into an unstable workplace and the chilling effect that has on American democracy. We have an incredible panel of folks here to give us their firsthand perspective. I'd like to introduce Matthew Fuller, Senior Politics Editor at the Daily Beast.
Hey.
Sarah Groh, Chief of Staff for Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley.
Thanks for having me.
Sarah Idrisu, Chief of Staff for Congressman Jamal Bowman.
Hi, good afternoon.
And Ted Lieu, the Congressman from California's 33rd District. So before we start, I just want to acknowledge who isn't in the room. We tried and were unable to extend an invitation to a non-legislative staffer. Even though I made a good faith effort, I came up short. So as we have this discussion today, I want to make sure that we keep those folks top of mind as well. Because to borrow a phrase from Congresswoman Pressley, those closest to the pain should be closest to the power. And I don't think enough attention has been paid to their stories. For members in the audience, if you have a question, we will have about 10 minutes for audience questions at the end of the panel. So if you just want to put them in the chat, and we'll make sure to get to some of your questions at the end. So I want to start for all our panelists with a very basic question. I don't want anyone to feel a need to relive their trauma on this stage, but I'd love for each of you to give us a sense of how it is to go to work every day after January 6th and how that day has changed your job. Let's start with Sarah Groh.
Hey, thanks so much for bringing us together, Melissa. As you said, this is such an important conversation, and we represent some of the Hill community. There were so many folks impacted by that day, and who can continue to be impacted as they go about the day-to-day of running the nation's capital and doing our daily work. You know, I will say for me, on the 6th, I was in the Capitol complex with my boss, and the prevailing emotion in the aftermath was just anger. It felt like something that so many of us have been calling the question on, from members of Congress to chiefs of staff to folks who work in every operational function up there, raising the flag that these threats were persistent, and they were deeply concerned about what was going to happen on the 6th. You know, I think as I was talking to folks in the days that followed too, I could not think of an example that made more plain that white supremacy and violent organized white supremacy is a persistent threat to all of us. Now, that being said, let me name the disproportionate risk of the folks of color on campus and the gradients of like privilege and protection that I had. But quite literally, you had a scenario where my boss, you know, a visible, well-known member of Congress, a Black woman, was certainly at risk that day. Given my proximity location, I was at risk as well. And so in engaging folks in conversation, I just wanted to make plain that these threats continue, they're persistent, and they impact the whole community. There's one moment I'll lift from that day. You know, there are many stories that haven't been told, and I think experiences that need daylight. There was a moment where, as has been reported, members were moving to different secure locations around the Capitol. At one point, there was conversation about an evacuation or airlift, and it had been relayed that members would be moved off campus first. I thought that made sense for a lot of reasons. And my boss turned to me and she said, "I'm not leaving without you." She had been in the complex on September 11th as a staffer. And, you know, that day brought up for her a lot of visceral memories of what it was like to, you know, see members moved off campus, support staff and staffers left behind, cell phone communication down. And I remember in that moment looking at her husband, it was the three of us alone in the location we were in, and kind of had a quick conversation, in eye and look, and said, she has to go. She's just at a risk that I am not at here. I can fly under the radar, and I will get out. So I will offer that. I think those moments stay with us, but I want to name that while we were all impacted disproportionately, just as that threat was very clear in its intent, there was a noose erected on the west lawn of the Capitol. I want to make very plain that the impact on staff was and remains very disparate.
Yeah.
Thank you. Sarah Idrisu, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thank you for that, Sarah. There were lots of things that happened that day. For me and my staff, it was the third day of work officially on Capitol Hill. Our office barely had office supplies. Most of my staff, except for myself and our staff assistant and the member, were not even there. So I told my staff to not come anywhere near it, knowing that we didn't have the infrastructure to deal with any emergencies had they risen. For new offices, this is a time of extreme stress and time where there's a lot of work. And so when the event happened, my staff just had this propensity to try to keep working. And so they had to be told to pause, to not work. And they were just really stressed out knowing that people that they loved were in that building. And then when I went down that day to the service workers, I'm actually originally from Washington, D.C., Capitol Hill areas where I grew up. I looked at the service workers and I asked them, how are you getting home tonight? And the woman, a Black woman, and I'm a Black woman, looked at me and said, I don't know, girl, we'll figure it out. So I was enraged that there was no transportation plan, that this woman would actually take the bus home on a day when there is a terrorist attack on our Capitol. And so I, did a small prayer for her and then went back to our office. My boss was told that he would have a place to go and seek shelter. And he looked at myself and looked at our staff assistant, who was also a Black woman, and said, how am I going to leave my staff here and seek protection? So in a lot of ways, the lack of protection that day that staff and service workers within our building felt reverberates, and it's reinforced. Things like the mask mandates not being enforced poses a biological risk to our bodies, while our minds were still healing from the attack that happened on the 6th. So the trauma on top of trauma continues. And so luckily all of us went home that night, but just the act of getting in a car, I was physically shaking. I didn't have a car. I had to actually call a friend who had a car. Otherwise I'd have to call an Uber, and there were no Ubers that day. So I'm painting small pictures about how we actually got home that day, and thinking about how you had to defend yourself on grounds and at a moment where it felt like nobody was coming to help you.
Thank you. Congressman?
Thank you, Melissa, for moderating this panel, and it's an honor to be on with all the panelists. And thank you to the people who are watching, and really glad that Netroots Nation does what you do every year. So thank you for doing that. On January 6th, because of the pandemic, they actually didn't want most members of Congress on the House floor. So many of us were watching from our offices, and I was in the Cannon House office building when loud banging started occurring down the hallway, and the banging started getting louder. And I asked my chief of staff, I said, what is that? And he didn't know. And then eventually the banging comes to our door, and a Capitol Police officer rushes in, and he says, you need to get out of here. And so when a police officer says that, you follow that order. So we left my office and went down 5 flights of stairs to the basement tunnels because Cannon had gotten some sorts of threats. And I still to this day, I'm not exactly sure what that was, but they said Longworth was safe. So we went to Longworth office building, and we really didn't know what was happening. And then as we were waiting in the Longworth office building and looking at our phones, it became clear that a mob was attacking Capitol Hill. So then we called to see if there's some members' offices where members were letting people in. So Congressman Cicilline graciously let us in. We walked to the Rayburn office building through the tunnels. And as we were looking at the media reports, it became clear after a while that not only was this mob attacking Capitol Hill, but that they were basically incited to do so by the then President of the United States. And so while under lockdown, we concluded that we've got to get this president out of there in terms of electorally, that he should no longer be president. So we started drafting the article of impeachment, and we worked remotely with Congressman Jamie Raskin. And if you sort of think about that particular point in time, the then president still was going to be in office until January 20th. And so our view was, we don't know what other even more crazy things this person could do in the next 2 weeks. And that's why we thought it was so important that we at least launch an article of impeachment so that the Senate would have it and that they could remove him immediately at any point in time. So that was one of the impetuses for drafting this article of impeachment, in addition to us believing it was the right thing to do. And in terms of sort of some of the consequences afterwards, as one of the House impeachment managers, they basically gave each of us 24/7 security from Capitol Police, both in DC and in our district. So when we went back home, there was a contingent of Capitol Police that would go to our district and basically make sure that we were secure. And then in terms of travel, even to this day, Capitol Police is notified of places I'm going in terms of travel. We now have metal detectors before we enter the House floor. So there's been a number of changes, and it really makes you think a lot more about security in a way that I never had to do so before.
Thank you. And Matt?
Yeah, I was thinking about your question as everyone was talking here, and I was on the Hill yesterday, and I was showing around one of our reporters who was sort of new, and I've done that sort of Capitol tour countless times, and usually, it's like, oh, there's the west front door, that's where the president walks out during inauguration. There's the east front, and the president walks out that door. And now it's kind of like every time I'm going through the Capitol, it's like, there's the east front door. That's the door that they breached, and they broke the glass, and the glass was still broken for months after. That's another thing about living in and working in a crime scene, was that for months there was evidence of this. There was blood on the floor outside of the House gallery for literal weeks that they just had not cleaned up. I was for my experience on January 6th, I was in the House chamber. I was in the gallery. I was one of the very last people to get evacuated. We got sort of stuck in no man's land when they were banging up the glass to the chamber doors. And again, it's like how I would normally introduce those doors would be, oh, those are the doors. That's when, the sergeant at arms comes out and says, Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States, right? And now it's like, no, that's the door where they were banging up the glass and they were trying to come through. And I thought I was going to see like a turkey shoot, basically. You had cops on either side with guns drawn. That was the situation. And I think, for me, that's sort of the profound change of Capitol Hill is wherever I go, right? It's now in a lot more in relation to that January 6th moment than previously. Previously, it was a very positive experience. It was, this is history. This is living history right here. These are important halls and corridors. And now it's like, that's where they trampled through and they overcame, Capitol Police, and they charged through and they were chanting, hang Mike Pence and whatnot. So in that way, like, I think there is a real trauma. I feel very lucky to not have any real lasting effects, I think, of like a true PTSD experience. However, I think so many people lived through a real trauma on Capitol Hill. And as we said, custodians, health workers, food workers, all these people are dealing with this, and they don't have, I guess, the perch or the privilege to have this like megaphone to say, this is my experience, this is how I lived out, and they're sort of quietly dealing with that trauma. And I think there's a lot of people on Capitol Hill to this day. We're approaching a year now, close to it, and it's a real thing. And I think for people who were there, it's going to be very tough to think of Capitol Hill. I look forward to the day when I walk through and I see the east front door and I go, that's the east front door. That's where the departing president leaves usually. And I think that's going to take real time.
Thank you. For Sarah and Sarah, you're charged both with helping your boss as a chief of staff and the staff who work in your congressperson's office be and feel safe. How do you approach that? And what do your coworkers need as part of that process?
I can jump in. That's actually a very good question. One thing that we did was make sure that we had limited amount of people in the Capitol for as long as possible until it was necessary to bring them back, knowing that the grounds felt unsafe for my staff, and my staff demographically are 80% people of color. Most are Black, and that knowing that being on the Capitol, while it's such a privilege and is definitely shrouded with prestige, you walk in and you see pictures of Native Americans being slaughtered. You don't see images of yourself. And you're asked to do a lot of work very quickly in an environment that doesn't respect yourself as a human. So the first thing we had to do was just recognize the gravity of what they're being asked to do and the context in which they were doing that work. And the fact that my boss, being such a high profile member who's actively advocating, also meant that we had a lot of incoming. So it's important for me, while managing my staff and my boss, to remind everyone to pace themselves. We have things like unlimited paid time off. You had to force people to take it sometimes. And then having sometimes people taking time off doesn't work alone. So the whole office would need to get shut down, pointing to people what the priorities are and what actually needs to get done and what can wait. And then myself looking for signals of trauma within my staff. It became very hard to determine what was a performance issue and what was actually a trauma response. And also trying to make sure I recognize it within myself when I'm managing a team. I think the hardest thing about being a chief of staff is you set the tone for everyone. And if you're not in the best place, nobody can be. And if my staff are watching this, I'm sure they're laughing. So knowing that when I'm being a jerk, like I need to pause, maybe, something is happening to me, and modeling things like therapy. Like when we have our morning calls, I will tell my staff, hey, at 1 o'clock today, I have therapy. Just letting you know that I need that time alone for myself, and just normalizing mental health, but also recognizing the historical context in which what we endured is sitting under, that this isn't just one attack, that this is a layered white supremacist and white tribalism that attacked our own identities and not just the Capitol and our beings in this space. So making space to have those conversations, normalizing those conversations, and then having lots of one-on-ones and checking in with people, centering ourselves in gratitude for the work that we are able to do despite how difficult it is. But generally it's tough and it's a work in progress. And sometimes I fall short, but recognizing that that's okay, and just improving every day.
I would second so much of what Sarah offered. And I'd also pick up on a line from the congressman in a comment that he made in the open here. I think accountability is so critical to the healing of the entire Hill community, but also folks across the nation. And that has certainly been something that we have been pushing for. I think without accountability, without consequences and recourse, a lot of, with all due respect, Matt, but the media focusing a lot on humanizing narratives of folks that participated in the events of the 6th, rather than making plain, those impacted, from our custodial staff to cafeteria workers to Capitol Police. I think that has been a real challenge. My mom in the days that followed said to me, watching this attack on TV was like watching the towers fall on September 11th, knowing you were inside. And that has really stuck with me in terms of the impact of folks in proximity to us. But that does not feel like that has been the public narrative or response to what happened. It feels incredibly disparate, incredibly different. We know that a lot of that has to do with who perpetrated this attack, what those motivations are. But as the congressman said, there's so many questions that remain about who knew what when, about who was engaged, about who within this institution aided and abetted. And so frankly, I think accountability is so important in our healing and how we move forward and how we prevent, similar attacks in the future. I'll also say, in terms of managing our team and taking care of our staff, unfortunately in Congresswoman Presley's office, we were not new to these types of threats and this type of violence. The 6th was unprecedented, yes, but since shortly after our arrival in Congress, when my boss was sworn in early 2019, my 22-year-old staff assistants are used to fielding death threats every day. It has become rote for them to pass them along to relevant agencies, to try to recognize a voice, to try to establish a trend and a theme. And these are things that, are deeply impactful for staff, at every level, but also something that I wish my team did not have to do as part of their job. Consistent with what Sarah offered, our team is very diverse, our team is very young, our team is about 80% folks of color. And so there is a lot of proximity to these experiences in terms of the underlying themes that we saw front and center on the 6th that made plain these threats and this violence. But also, this was not non sequitur or disconnected for our team. I'll never forget many members coming up to my boss when we took that initial vote, I think, to certify the election results. My recall is it was sometime between 2 and 4 a.m., but someone can correct the record there. And I remember other members coming up to my boss and saying, I think I got a taste of what you've been experiencing for months today. I didn't quite understand, but now I do. And so I would love to see us lean into both accountability, but also that moment of shared understanding that these persistent threats remain, that they are real, that they are consistent, and they deeply impact our staff, and they deeply impact the operations staff that runs the Hill every day.
Thank you. You both teed up my next 2 questions nicely. Matt, so as a journalist who is covering this, there's such a focus, I think, in media on objectivity. And how is it realistic to expect reporters to be objective after they themselves were also subject of a terrorism attack? And how do you feel political media, you and your colleagues, have done in covering it since?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, it's important to note that objectivity isn't Republicans say this, Democrats say that. That's, just stenography. That's, giving equal time to things that aren't equal a lot of the times. So our role as journalists is to report the truth. And sometimes one side, neither side has a monopoly on the truth, but sometimes one side has more truth on their side. So I think that's an important thing to recognize. I will say how things have changed in journalism. I think there's been a little bit of a healthy reset here. Certainly, I don't think you're seeing stories where we've got this budget crisis, right, going on. And I don't think you're going to see people go up to Paul Gosar and go, Congressman Gosar, what are you thinking on this debt ceiling? And I say that as someone who has asked Paul Gosar in the past many times about the budget, about the debt ceiling. That's just not where we're at. I think it's hard for a lot of reporters, and I think this is healthy, to just disregard the role of a lot of these members in stoking this. And I think you treat a lot of those members a little differently, and it's certainly not something we're just going to, say, oh, that was January 6th and now it's January 7th. One of the, the most jarring things for me watching January 6th was, I was in that gallery. We went through this whole ordeal, and then hours later, we're back in the gallery. I'm sitting in my exact same seat. I'm sitting about 12 feet from where that woman was shot. And, Elise Stefanik is doing this whole sort of performance about how thankful she is for the Capitol Police, and then almost literally turns a page in her speech and starts going on to the prepared remarks that she had hours before about how Arizona should be decertified. So for a lot of politicians, this was just this small blip, this small little thing in we can literally just turn the page and keep on going on in the same direction. And I think for a lot of reporters, it has been healthy that where I just don't think you're going to see people earnestly quoting Josh Hawley without noting his role in this, or Ted Cruz, or again, Mo Brooks, Paul Gosar, those sorts of folks. I think there has been a healthy amount of skepticism that's been introduced here. And I think that it's been good for reporters to see that, hey, you know what, we can be real about this. We don't have to just quote both sides and leave it at that. There is a perspective. Every reporter has a perspective. I think you can be very honest about that perspective. You don't have to be partisan, but you don't have to be neutral. And I think that January 6th has been a really healthy thing in that way. Just if we're looking for some positive from this.
I sure hope so. Congressman Liu, let's talk a little about accountability, because there has been almost none for your colleagues on the other side of the aisle who fanned the flames for months and are now thwarting investigation attempts at every turn. What does accountability for those members of Congress look like, and how in the hell are we going to be able to hold them for account?
So thank you for that question. There are different kinds of accountability. I think one is historical accountability. It's another reason we did their impeachment. We wanted to at least do what we could as soon as possible to preserve the evidence and the videos and the images, and make people remember what actually happened on January 6th, what led up to January 6th, and the consequences of January 6th. And I think we were able to present a pretty strong case to American people. It was a vote of 57 to 43, which was bipartisan in the Senate. In any other context, it would be a blowout. That was a pretty strong bipartisan majority who believed the former president incited the insurrection. And so I think history will look back, and decades from now, kids will be taught that there was an insurrection and the former president incited it. There's also accountability in terms of people who may have violated the criminal laws. That is not something Congress can do. That's something that the Department of Justice is going to have to do. And so they're already, in fact, have gone after a lot of folks who have violated the criminal laws. In terms of members of Congress, I'm not privy to their investigations or what they're looking at doing, but I'm sure that if they believe any member of Congress has violated criminal laws, they will be investigating that. And then there's political accountability now. What do we do to make sure that the people that assisted in inciting this insurrection are held accountable? So one way is through the ballot box, and make sure that next year that Democrats win the midterms, and that the people and the party that thinks that this insurrection was no big deal, that they lose at the midterms. So that's one way, is through the ballot box. Another way is through some of their committees that we've set up. So the January 6th committee is investigating this exact insurrection, and they're going to be, they have already called in witnesses. They're going to be calling in more witnesses. They'll have additional hearings. So they're going to continue to investigate what happened on January 6th and make a fuller presentation to American people on exactly what led up to it, what happened that day, and how to make sure it never happens again.
Thank you. I feel like this might be a little redundant question, but I want to ask it anyway for Sarah and the congressman. Again, we have members who either were fanning the flame up to may have been involved in planning the insurrection or assisting the insurrectionists. How do you work alongside these folks? And is it possible to have a working relationship in a democratic body with folks who are at best sympathetic to the insurrection, at worst were, perhaps how to roll in it?
I am happy to start. I will say that unlike my boss, many of those folks that have been named of playing a role or being sympathetic to the attack on the 6th, in my view, do not have an interest in governing, do not have an interest in legislating, do not spend their days in committee hearings or introducing bills. And frankly, that is the work that my boss and that our office remains focused on, because we believe that we have to use every tool we can exact to advance her vision of justice for the people in the 7th. And move on these broader issues of consequence that are really urgent in our communities across the country. So I will just offer that, in that context. I think the way in which many of those offices spend the balance of their time and what their motivations are for walking the halls of Congress are very different from ours.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm not sure they're here to work on behalf of people and the larger people, but I do think they represent a very dangerous strand in America right now, and are really proud of that. So walking in the hallways, we are unfortunately neighboring to one of these insurrectionists, people who aided the insurrectionists, or at least rooted them on. And so we see them all the time, and there's always this tension without speaking to each other. And it, little things like not wearing your mask and being very proud of it, or pretending to cough when my staff walks past them as a joke, are things that make it impossible to work with people that do not care to see you be well, and also the wellness of our country.
That's a very interesting question, and I think it's even broader than just January 6th. So prior to Congress, I served 9 years in California State Legislature, and even though it was very Democratic, we also had a number of Republicans, and I would work with them on all sorts of issues because they weren't crazy. So what happened in the last 4 years is we started to get a certain kind of Republican elected official that was crazy. And maybe there's another word for that, but I'll just use the shorthand crazy for now, where it's really difficult to work with them because you don't have the same reality. So in the past, for example, if we're working on an issue, we would agree on the same set of facts, and you might have different ways of how to accomplish that goal. But if someone tells you that an apple is actually a banana, you can't really go forward. I mean, you can't really work with that person because they're in a completely different reality than you are. And in the last 4 years, I've seen more and more of those folks being elected on the Republican side, and you just don't work with them. You find other people who an apple says, yeah, that's an apple. Now let's talk about how we can go forward and do different things with that apple. But it is very troubling that you have a growing number of Republican voters and Republican elected officials who simply don't accept basic facts.
Well, you mentioned state legislature. You all keep teeing up my next question, which is amazing and very prescient. Thank you. You mentioned state legislatures. I actually want to broaden this discussion because I actually wrote an article earlier this year about what's happening in state legislatures and how the far right is building power. And I talked to folks in Michigan and Arizona and other states. And what I heard was very similar to what I'm hearing today. What we're seeing in Congress right now, there are versions of it playing out in state legislatures too, where more extremists are getting elected to office and are more comfortable expressing extremist, white supremacist, patriarchal views publicly. Just a broad question for everyone on the panel: can a democracy survive in an environment like this, knowing that what's happening in the halls of Congress is also happening in state bodies all across the country?
Yeah, I'm happy to take a first bite at that question. But I do think it can. It is why people like our bosses and Congressman Liu are so important, because you do need to have people who are fighting for progressive values and know that these policies and this way of governing is not just given, that we need to actually ensure that every day we're fighting to uplift those who are most marginalized and historically disenfranchised by our laws and history. So I do think there's hope and there's optimism. I see it in Sarah Groh's boss and my boss and many other members, as well as, most importantly, as organizers and people on the ground who actually are the basis of our democracy and not these people who aided and abetted the insurrectionists.
I think state legislatures are incredibly important. In a number of states, they are the body that actually draws the legislative maps, both for state seats as well as congressional seats. They also have a huge role if they want to exercise it in terms of passing laws regarding voting rights, regarding what their Secretary of State can or cannot do. And I think it's very important for people who care about democracy to focus not just on federal races, but also on state races. At the same time, I think we did have institutions that, although they did bend, they also held. And so I still want to remind people that if you look, for example, at the Mueller report, regardless of what you think of it or whether or not he did a good job, at the end of the day, you still had an investigation of a Republican president led by a Republican, Robert Mueller, done at a time when Republicans controlled the House and the Senate and the White House. And that report and investigation was allowed to go forward until its completion. That's pretty amazing. I don't know how many countries would have allowed that process to happen that way. So that still gives me hope that our institutions, even during a lot of bludgeoning these last 4 years, ultimately at the end of the day, they did hold.
Melissa, I would just add, you spoke to this briefly, but I think there's a bit of a misnomer in the public sphere too, that the infiltration of elected office by organized and violent white supremacists is a resurgent or new phenomenon. It's been part of the American story since our nation's inception. And that's something that I think is so important about discussing very plainly about the 6th as well. I think it is easy to get into a kind of hyperbolic characterization of who was there on the Capitol. Let's make plain that these folks were members of law enforcement. These folks were school board members, PTO parents, soccer coaches. And that is something that we just need to speak plainly about, and we need to speak more about. I think it also underscores how important this governing moment is for Democrats. I know that's certainly my view, as well as the Congresswoman's view. We have a small window here. Certainly, we will do everything we can to hold this majority and govern effectively for as long as we have the privilege. But given the attacks, the coordinated attacks at the state level on voting rights, we just have to move with urgency. There is clearly no room for error here. Brittany Packnett Cunningham often says scared power is no power at all. And I think that is a reminder in our office that every day the clock is ticking on doing everything that we can to strengthen our democracy, to protect against attempts to erode, the power at the ballot box, the rights of voters, but also, even just as importantly, really addressing the history of this country and making plain the reforms needed to protect all people who call this nation home. And, the urgency could not be stronger in this moment.
And if I can double click on a really important part of what all of you said was important, Sarah, and a really, really important part of that is this is not new, that Tulsa happened as a result, Tulsa race riots, as a result of Black wealth growing and Black power growing. And then we had other incidents where the power of Black and brown people and people of color and LGBTQIA and people with disabilities, whenever their power grows, there's always a response. And that response is usually threats. It's a noose. So that noose was representative of resistance towards that power and that growth. And so we've been here before, and we're here again. And so it's important for us to continue to fight and know that we stand on history.
And Matt, I'd love to hear your take on this question as well. Especially, I think about how often journalists are doing their work under threat as well. And certainly they're doing their work under threat from some of the same folks, although the threat is different.
Yeah. There's a couple things that I thought were really smart here. I agree with Congressman Liu that we're in a bend not break situation. I think our institutions largely did hold over the Trump administration, and they continue to hold. I will also point out that, if you're a Republican new to office, and I think this also builds on something the Congressman said, if you're a Republican, what's motivating you to run for office right now? What's your mindset in being a Republican who says, are you trying to fix things, or are you trying to go along with the Trump narrative and the Trumpism and that brand of politics? And I think by and large, the Republicans who we've recently elected, who've put themselves up for office, they very strongly believe in this. I think there's a lot of Republicans who were previously elected who had a lot of these strains. And again, this is nothing new to our country or to Republican politics. This has all been sort of building here. But the Republicans who have just come to Congress, the Republicans who are just elected to state legislatures, I think are a lot more comfortable with this brand of whatever you want to call it. And that to me is frightening. And I also, just to speak, we as a member of the press, I underwent a number of death threats after January 6th. I moved after January 6th. We are dealing with real threats. We are actually, to a lot of these people, part of the problem. You saw them burning in effigy, news equipment and things like that. This is, it's a real thing, and it certainly makes it harder to do our job, because we're not there to pick a side. We are there to report as accurately and truthfully as possible. And it just so happens that a lot of the things these people believe in are wrong. It is, apple and banana. And when we're the people's side calling out, no, that is actually an apple. We have become, in short, an enemy of theirs.
Thank you. So I have one more prepared question, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. I have a couple already, but if you have a question, put it in the chat. I obviously won't get to everyone, but I will try. My last prepared question, Congressman Liu, is for you. We talked at the top of the panel about the people who aren't here today. As a member of Congress, what are you and your colleagues' obligations to make the Hill a safe workplace for those who work there? And I mean everyone from your staff to custodians to food service workers. And has there been any discussion about ensuring their safety and addressing their trauma moving forward?
That's a great question. So at a very general level, we did put in more funding for security. So that obviously protects everyone who works in the Capitol. I also do think just in general, everyone's wages need to go up. It's just low wages, not only from member staffs, but also just people working in the Capitol. I think it is a very good point that oftentimes we don't think about the people that make the Capitol run, right? That are doing all those services. And it's not clear to me that if they, for example, have mental trauma, where they go. And so I will look into that issue now that you raised it. I think it's a very good issue to look into. And so thank you for raising that. But I do think if we could just raise wages and increase security funding, that is a step forward. But I'm very open to doing a lot more other things as well.
Thank you. I think some of us will follow up on that. I mean, it's Sarah Idrisu's story in the beginning of talking to the woman who had no idea how she was going to get home and just found a way. It was very striking. And I think we owe these folks who help keep our government run so much more than for them. So I'm going to switch over to audience questions. The first one is from Robin Swirling. In other workplaces, there are EEOC and Title VII protection for workers whose colleagues incite violence against them or harass them about their transgender children, for instance. What options are there in Congress for addressing hostile workplace concerns for people who don't feel safe at work because of the people they have to come into contact with as a result of their job? I'm guessing Sarah and Sarah will have some thoughts on this, but I'll open it up to anyone.
I'll say, Melissa, this has been a persistent challenge on the Hill, both in terms of the example referenced in the question, in terms of harassing members, invoking their family members, discriminatory language that cuts across all lived experiences. As Sarah also pointed out, right now, frankly, the Committee on House Administration, which oversees many of the day-to-day operations and other functions up there, is having a real challenge with even mask compliance in shared spaces. So, I think that certainly creates a context that's challenging for folks' physical health and psychological safety, within the Capitol community. I think recourse is limited. I will, one of the simplest ways I describe this when folks ask me a bit about kind of the centralized infrastructure or HR in Congress and would welcome others to add on, every office is its own small business. So certainly, my boss and I take, responsive and extraordinary measures and continue to seek feedback from our team, knowing we won't get it right in every moment, to do everything that we can to protect folks, to offer redress, in circumstances like that. But there is no neutral arbiter. There is no centralized office on the House side where you can take these concerns or persistent issues. And that's a real challenge.
Absolutely. And Congress is such a unique workplace because of the power dynamics involved when the person who is often doing these things is a member of Congress, and there's so much more power in that person. So very few workplaces have this dynamic where you're dealing with very powerful people and very oftentimes younger staff who are really trying to make their career happen and don't want to make sure that their reputation's intact. So we need to work to identify that power dynamic is an indicator of likelihood of a volatile and a toxic workplace. And I will say oftentimes there is a lot of things in Congress happening that would not lie in other workplaces that I've been, including the ones that were just mentioned, but also federal workers are not able to unionize. And so that additionally makes it difficult for folks to organize and to speak up against conditions that are just not fair. Lastly, in many workplaces, in addition to perhaps unions, there is strong HR practices that are at least, I mean, not strong, but there is HR, and there is a professional who understands employment law and can guide. Oftentimes, as chiefs, we have to learn that ourselves and seek counsel. And there is many opportunity for folks in that position to make mistakes and not see things, and for people inside the workplace to not know what their rights are. We do take workplace rights trainings, but it's not going to cover things like hateful incidents when it's a member of Congress or when it's an insurrection. And so recognizing the unique nature of this workplace and adapting regulations and enforcement to it is very, very important.
Yeah, thank you. I will just say that one of the things I've heard consistently, I have a lot of readers apparently who work in HR for the newsletter. And I got so many letters like, this would never fly in any other workplace. Like there's no other workplace where someone can like harass you and show up to work the next day. So I think that's something that the public may not be aware of, that folks who work on the Hill just don't and have the same protections. Not that any workers in America have great protections, but folks on the Hill have even fewer. Our next question is from Allison. I'm sorry I missed your last name. It continues to feel dangerously emblematic that real trauma from experienced violence towards Black and people of color identities, as has just been shared by the panelists, is continuously met with very weak accountability efforts from our justice system and government infrastructure, especially with such visible acts of white supremacy. How do we reconcile what this continued lack of action means for the lived experience of many Americans? Congressman, you want to take this one? I'm just going to call people out if nobody.
Sure. So, if someone violates criminal laws, right, it's not a lot that Congress can do. That is something the Department of Justice or the local DA and so on, they're going to have to identify that and then go and do the prosecutions. Now, it is also true that in our nation's history, there's just been a lot of violence against minorities, right? And it's something that we just have to recognize that is part of our history, and we have to continue to do better. On the House Judiciary Committee, we've held a number of hearings on white supremacy. The FBI has identified basically white supremacist groups as the leading and most dangerous domestic terrorist groups in America. And they are devoting more resources to go after those groups. And we're seeing, I think, as sort of alluded to before, you have folks that are watching the demographics change, and it really bothers them. So if you look at the January 6th insurrection, there was an interesting Washington Post article that suggested that the folks that showed up, it wasn't because that somehow they had economic anxiety. That the greatest sort of indicator whether they would appear on January 6th was the rate of change of white people in their county. And so if their county was losing white population, or in other words, minorities were moving in, that was actually a better indicator of whether they were one of the January 6th insurrectionists. So I do think what we're watching is a certain segment of the American population that is still stuck in the 1950s, and they see this country changing in ways they do not like, and they're acting out sometimes in very violent ways. So one way to try to stop this is one is to acknowledge it, and then we can certainly say things to try to encourage Department of Justice or other law enforcement institutions to take action. But in a day, if someone's going to engage in criminal behavior, we're going to have to rely on our justice system to execute what they've traditionally been doing, which is go after people that violate the law.
Thank you. So we have a question from the audience about the role that social media companies played in aiding and abetting this insurrection. This question is of particular interest to me as someone who spent my holidays tracking all of this on social media and seeing the buildup, and then seeing both law enforcement say, oh, we had no way of knowing, and social media companies, especially Facebook, say, not it. So I would love to hear thoughts on the role that social media played in the insurrection and continued failures. And Matt, I will throw it.
Yeah. Well, first of all, when you bring up that question, I think of there were obviously a lot of continued threats after January 6th and in the buildup into the inauguration. And I recall this one specific thing that we were thinking about reporting on. And basically, we heard from law enforcement that, hey, please don't say this or like give them actual dates when these people are going to start coming, because basically we've shut down a lot of the social media that they are using, that the Telegram groups that they were using to coordinate are gone. And, a lot of the means of actual communication have been basically hampered in some significant way. And they're kind of relying on the media to get this narrative out there. I mean, January 6th, the quote, stop the steal thing, that was a slow buildup over months. And I was also watching that hashtag sort of build and thinking, what exactly is this going to look like on that day? I think, there's a very fair conversation to have about Facebook's role, Twitter's role, and then a lot of these other more fringy elements where there's maybe even truly more coordinated planning going on. I think everyone had this moment a few days ago when Facebook went down of, man, maybe this is what society needs. And there was almost like this moment of hope that there was a lot of great tweets and memes about this, but like, oh my God, I can't believe this. My grandma is finally going to be vaccinated, or, oh my God, my racist uncle's, what's he going to do now? Like, I think there's a very real element here where for so long, you used to hear an older generation say, oh, those video games are going to, rot your brains. And it ended up happening that Facebook rotted their brains. It's not really young people who are coordinated and sharing crazy, stupid memes about, Joe Biden's memory loss and stuff like that. It's an older generation, and it's people who are looking for a sense of community. And maybe this does come back to, how it used to be. And I see this minority down the street moving, like crazy things like that. And they're turning to Facebook and their old friends from college and high school or whatever, and sharing openly racist crap. And they found this community on Facebook where they can, it's almost like living a second life of like, oh, I've seeking this approval. And I think for generations like mine, we kind of lived through this on a smaller scale through college. And then it was like, okay, I'm done with Facebook now. And for a lot of like boomer people, a lot of the people who were, I would venture to say almost everyone who was there on January 6th was extremely active on Facebook. You see it, Marjorie Taylor Greene was doing for years these like performances on Facebook, knocking on AOC's door and hounding down, school shooting victims, and like posting that to her adoring fans, her friends. And I think that's built a really dangerous just community of people who, are looking for approval, looking for something, affirmation in their lives and identity. And they finally found it with something like Facebook. And that sucks. Like that's not the way we want to build communities. And I do think, Facebook's going to have to look at the information that they allowed to be shared. Twitter's going to have to figure out, when a hashtag sort of becomes, when a peaceful protest jumps into something else, they've got to look at those things. And I get why, Republicans are so mad about Section 230 and, this idea that Facebook and Twitter are out to get them. And I think, the reality is Facebook and Twitter are not out to get them enough, that they actually need to crack down on a lot of these things and, figure out ways that we're going to stop misinformation, stop people sharing anti-vax campaign stuff and, horrible election conspiracies and stuff like that. That's a real issue that these social media companies have to wrestle with, and they have to do it, yesterday.
I would add, I really appreciate the question. If folks have not watched the Whistleblower Testimony from this week in the Senate, I highly encourage you to watch it. One thing that struck me, there was a line where she offered context around, kind of the motivations here and real clarity that Facebook knows exactly what they're doing. They have the internal data and they stand to make a profit margin because hate is a quick reaction motivator, right? And so the content is very curated. This is very intentional. Picking up on a theme in the previous question, I think so often we conveniently fall into a narrative that many things that have happened in this country are happenstance and not intentional policy. And we really need to set the record straight on that. So much of what I heard in that Facebook whistleblower testimony tracked to conversations and hearings that the Congresswoman has been in when we talk about the history of redlining. I think there are many people in this country that think by happenstance, folks settled on the basis of race, and not that there were institutional policy decisions made at the federal level on down that created the conditions for oppression, for suppression, for organized violence. And so we just need to speak very plainly about that. I will say, additionally, it does not feel like we are capacity matched to take on these threats. And so I certainly, call on Congress and every level of government to exact their oversight authority and move with urgency. These threats are not, mean comments on the internet. I think there's much narrative that gives credence to this being something small or insufficient. The rhetoric, the language, this is the same type of language that incites violence that, again, we have seen for decades and for generations. The format is just different. It's more insidious, it's more dangerous, and it moves more quickly. And so we need to speak very, very plainly about that. I think there's such a regulatory role for Congress to play here. I would also say, picking up on an earlier point around our systems and who they do and don't protect, my boss, from her People's Justice Guarantee legislation to other frameworks she's offered, has challenged many of the kind of status quo conditions in which we have disproportionately placed value on some lives and continued to not value and center the lives of Black Americans and other BIPOC folks. Every time we put forward legislation that aims to address that status quo, there is a backlash, as Sarah spoke to, right? There are imminent threats to her life and to her safety. And so I just can't underscore enough how persistent, how real, and how, consistent these threats are that are only exacerbated by the platforms we see on social media.
Absolutely. And there's a really strong need to regulate Facebook and other social media platforms. Physical mail has a process by which it is screened for poison, for threats within Congress after the 1990s anthrax scare. However, a lot of the threat that we get comes through social media, and they are often not screened. And there's no way of tracking and knowing which way they'll come. You just kind of open your DMs and oftentimes seeing the N-word, seeing things that are threatening my boss's life and our office, and having to respond every time as if this isn't part of a systemic thing, and knowing that Facebook knows this is happening is actually getting really tiring. So Facebook and other social media platforms need to take a strong regulatory stance towards hate and hate speech and threats because we see it every single day in our inboxes.
I just want to add quickly that it goes beyond social media, right? It's right-wing talk radio. It's organizations like Newsmax and OAN and National Fox News. I remember when we were doing their impeachment trial, and it was prime time, and the presentation was one of the videos showing the assaults on police officers and attack on the Capitol. Was one of our most important segments. And I remember sort of looking at the TV screens, and you had CNN, MSNBC, the major networks showing the video, and then Fox News just cut away and they showed something totally different. And so if all you consume is Fox News, you may have a very different view of January 6th than the rest of America. And so it's just important to realize it's an entire ecosystem of right-wing media out there that is presenting a completely false and alternate reality to the Republican base. And it's important to call that out. And the polling shows that people understand that radical Republicans are dangerous. And I think we just have to keep repeating that.
I was muted. I want to thank our panelists today for coming and talking about this. And thank you for sharing your stories. And hopefully this will not be forgotten and gives our audience at Netroots Nation a way forward. Thanks all.